Hey folks, welcome. And for those of you that have been waiting for over 15 minutes, thank you for waiting. We've had some large technical difficulties so far, but we were able to brave through them. So thank you for waiting and for joining. Let's kickstart real quick. So my name is Josh Palma, and I'm a PM lead on the AKS team, and I'll hand it over to Craig.
Thanks, George. I'm a PM on the upstream team, so I work closely with the AKS team to work in the open source community. Back to you, George.
Yeah, so just quickly going through it, you've already been asking questions. For any questions that you might have, please use kind of the question box, ask them, and essentially our team of experts as well as ourselves will either address them live via voice or we'll address them on chat as well. And we'll try to go it fast so we can tackle all your questions that I know you've been waiting. And this session is being recorded, so please do not spam or try to kind of put inappropriate comments on the question boxes, and please adhere to the Microsoft Code of Conduct that we have on the next slide. And as a final point, probably give some time for our SMEs to introduce themselves. So from left to right, Alan.
Okay, so I'll go first. Hi everyone, my name is Ayabami. I'm a program manager with the App Dev CSU team, and happy to be here. Work really closely with George and team.
Sounds good. Don, you want to go next?
I'm Don High, principal customer engineering ISV for Fast Track. So I deal with a lot of ISV customers as well as startups, and with containerization, a lot of open source containerization, ISC infrastructure as code as well. So
very good. Alan, you're back.
Yes. Alan, principal software architect in Azure Global Engineering, working on things like Azure Space, Azure Orbital Emulator, and a secure software supply chain.
Cool. Raghuram?
Raghuram, cloud solution architect in the worldwide apps and infra tech strategy team, the customer success unit.
Very good. And do we have Rishab as well? I don't think we have Rishab. Right, so that's the team, and so let's maybe get the questions started.
Sure. So let's see. We've answered some of them already online. So most recently, we've got a question around the Windows Unification Initiative. I don't know if any of our panel of experts are aware of that. I'm guessing, George, you probably aren't aware of that, or at least I know I'm not. Any of us have expertise in that area?
No, without context, maybe we can ask some clarification on that.
Sure. Okay, so other interesting questions are, what are the major limitations when you're containerizing applications, and sort of what are the newest developments in containers that help us get around those limitations?
Interesting. Well, effectively, containers are a bit of a catch-all in some cases, and that there are natural workloads that don't really fit. I think we had a question before in terms of like UI-based scenarios, for example. That's really not usually a container native scenario. So having UIs and console applications really in containers. But there are many efforts still ongoing. Containers is still a very fluid and new technology to make sure that all essentially scenarios that you can think of are properly supported. I don't know if you want to talk about it from an upstream perspective, Craig. A lot of the essential applications about hardware and resources about hardware being exposed to containers is definitely something that is still evolving, because there are many pieces for hardware. If you think a few years back, containers didn't even support things like GPU or NUMA alignment or several networking capabilities. So today it's really a brave new world where most things that are usually exposed already for years past through hypervisors into VMs and into physical servers, today they're really exposed to containers, and there's even new developments happening, for example, on the fields of confidential computing, where really the technology is almost going container first and being developed with containers in mind. So definitely a lot of things are bringing containers as first party. Something to add up, Craig?
Yeah, thanks, George. I think the only thing I'd add is that it's really interesting to see how, as we get exposure of more of these underlying physical resources into containers, we're starting to see some of the container drivers try to solve exactly the same problems that the hypervisors were solving with resource sharing, resource contention, and isolation of the processes and the permissions for those processes. So the line between hypervisors and containers is gradually blurring, certainly in both the Linux and the Windows world. And in the Windows world, I think the interesting thing we're seeing is and this is one of the announcements that came out this week, is that Containerd is now in preview for Windows in AKS, and that allows for leveraging HCS version 2 in Windows, which will expose more and more of the underlying host capabilities into containers, and with a big focus on resource management going forward. Hopefully that was helpful.
Cool.
So there's a question about Azure Migrate, and I think they're just asking for the link, but I think it might make sense to spend a minute just kind of talking about the migration tooling and what Azure Migrate is all about.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm sure folks on the chat can definitely provide a link. So Azure Migrate tool is a tool essentially to migrate workloads to Azure, and has announced support for the migration of both .NET as well as Java applications. And you have a link on our documentation for both of them, and it's really to help you both take inventory and discover existing running applications, like running JVM application, and then effectively help you create the necessary steps, containerizing it, creating the Docker file, creating the Kubernetes manifest, and then deploying it into a live Kubernetes cluster. I'm not sure if the folks were able to share the links in the meantime, otherwise I'll take a quick peek and share them as well.
So maybe you can help me understand, that makes sense for kind of a simple, straightforward application, or there some kind of constraints about what kinds of applications make sense to use that kind of migrate tool, or is it very general and can work with anything?
Yeah, so right now it's only supporting Java and .NET, and the team is really expanding that into the additional array of languages. And the idea is that we want to keep kind of getting feedback from what should we go after next, and what kind of applications we should target next. Those were two of the biggest asks that we have for really some of the more, even sometimes more legacy applications that were even harder to containerize. And so this is why the tool went after those first, to kind of help with that process and help with that journey.
Makes sense. All right, we have another question around OSM. So for those of you who don't know, OSM is Open Service Mesh, and it's an open source project that tries to solve the sort of 80% problem for service meshes, solving the key east-west traffic shaping and and mutual TLS problems that are the core of service mesh, without having all the bulk of a complex system. Well, it's still a complex system, of course, to do all those things, but there's a lot more that it tries not to do. And there's a question around its ETA. And I assume that's ETA for GA in the AKS product.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'll tag team this one with Craig. So the ETA for GA with AKS is gonna have as a key milestone before that one the actual ETA for stable of our upstream open service mesh project, and then after that we will fast follow with the GA. If you want to talk a bit about the timelines we're thinking for stable on the project, it always depends on the necessary signal, customers, community adoption, and a lot more factors than just technical factors. So Craig, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. So the project is still evolving, not as nearly a rapid pace as it was, say, 6 months ago. It's reaching a level where we have good confidence that the core feature set is what matches what people really need to do in their clusters. Obviously, even once it's stable, there'll be new features, but the goal is to get to a point where the APIs aren't changing, and so your operational model won't change anymore. Right now, the trajectory looks like that stable point will happen during this calendar year. That we'll be in a position to do that. We're getting sufficient feedback to come to that degree of confidence. And then sometime after that, obviously, AKS will then be able to GA it. So there's no fixed date at this point. It really depends on how much quality feedback we get from early adopters and users. So, you know, if you want it earlier, evaluate it earlier and tell us how that's working for you. So let's see, what other interesting questions do we have coming in here? There's a lot. Thank you guys, and keep them coming. There's a question here about cloud bursting, which is an interesting kind of scenario-based one. So they have an application with microservices, and they want to make sure that when they burst, all the dependencies are first HTTPS, and that they resolve to either cloud-specific or on-premise specific implementations. So they're thinking about how to approach this kind of bursting scenario when you may have specific services available in different environments. And so, you know, it highlights the challenge that application developers have when you have to consider what APIs are available where. Do you have any thoughts about that, George?
Yeah, the kind of approach to use HTTP to kind of resolve them to different environments is definitely a common one and generally used. It still doesn't remove a lot of the challenges that we see when bursting from on-prem to the cloud. It's definitely something that is still very much on kind of the application side and the customization side on the user to define how they're actually going to burst. Obviously, the cloud is providing the burstable environments, and then you actually need to essentially take care of the actual bursting and the scheduling. AKS and Azure have several things to help with that, namely, for example, one of our open source projects, like the virtual kubelet, which could actually allow you to contribute to it and expand, because it actually gives you a virtual node on, for example, an on-premises Kubernetes cluster that then allows you to expand to essentially whatever that virtual node points to. On AKS, for example, we have one of the offers is called Virtual Node, which essentially leverages this technology to burst from just regular VMs as nodes into Azure Container Instances. And so it kind of becomes this infinite API that you use to schedule pods. And you could use exactly similar approaches from on-prem as well by extending and contributing back into a virtual kubelet. You could use same things, virtual kubelet, to extend from AKS to, for example, a device at the edge. So a little bit of the opposite scenario where you could do virtual kubelet to IoT edge, for example, which is another one that you can have there. And you have many providers already on virtual kubelet that you could use. And you can also build your own and contribute back some to meet your scenarios. So we are looking as a kind of a point of roadmap. It is a scenario that we're actually looking to have some design and some investment in the near future.
Great response. We love all the work and contributions to virtual kubelet. Thank you, everybody who has done that. Another really interesting question here is about state management for applications. So we all know that 12-factor only meets a very small percentage of real workloads for most people. And so the question is around, is there support of some libraries that are being provided to make things easier, at least on the Azure platform? And it's kind of a follow-up question is, it's asked, like, is Service Fabric not recommended going forward? Like, what's our stance on Service Fabric versus state management and other Azure services?
Yeah, I guess I can start from, I guess, the end and go back to the beginning. So essentially, it's not Service Fabric is not really recommended. Service Fabric is there and is set to stay. It's more that we acknowledge kind of the desire from our users to actually standardize on Kubernetes and cloud native, as well as in this kind of a more portable platform and Kubernetes-based platform, which is why you see all kind of the solutions and a bit of a pivot for kind of Azure's investments and even highlights and spotlights to actually be on AKS and Kubernetes-based platforms. So that's mostly a response on essentially what we hear from our users and from the market as well. but Service Fabric, if you're there, you don't need to run away because you hear little sessions about it or something like that. It's definitely still a very solid platform for you to stay. On the other hand, it did have, I would say, some pretty nice features and capabilities in terms of state. Some of them were actually bringing into AKS through several distributed applications. For example, you can think of Dapper as a way to actually bring a lot of that same capabilities into a Kubernetes-based environment, as well as the deep integration that it has with the Azure Storage components now. So with AKS, you can in a very raw fashion interact with Azure Disks, with Azure Files, NFS, and now with the advent of CSI drivers, which is the new drivers for Kubernetes, you can actually go across and say, hey, I need blob fuse and I need to interact directly with blob, or I need to interact directly with NFS or Azure Files, and you can really go on and have direct integrations with all of them without having to actually create the storage or manage it, etc. And from a developer perspective, from an application perspective, things like Dapper really also simplify that distributed storage access.
That's a great answer. So one more really interesting question here is, and I really appreciate people staying on, even though we're scheduled, we're past the scheduled time. That's very helpful, and keep this question coming. The question here is that I have an application with multiple services, and I'm currently using Docker Compose to group them together. What's the best practice to deploy these to production? And I'll take the follow on there that this is production on Azure. That's my color.
I see. So there's several aspects to it. The first thing that I would ask is, if it's already in production, is there a need? Essentially, what is, are you bringing it to Azure? If you look into things like, for example, Azure Migrate, which already has as well, again, this Docker support in order to bring it. If you went into essentially the documents for like pure Docker on Azure and hosting those environments, or you're looking for something more into bringing these applications into Kubernetes, for example, and wanting to bring from Docker Compose and kind of Docker native toolset into kind of the more Kubernetes-based toolset. So depending on which challenges you're trying to solve and where you want to go, you could go into as very simple as just creating a Docker Swarm, EE, whatever cluster on Azure, just deploy them and keep stay Docker native. Or if you want to use and leverage Kubernetes, you can use tools like Compose with a K that essentially allows you to translate some of the Docker Compose kind of manifests and elements into Kubernetes manifests and elements, and then allow you to go from there into a AKS Kubernetes cluster and start to deploy there as well.
That's a great answer. I just added that to the chat to help folks out. So we are running out of experts, and there aren't any new questions yet at this point. Oh, there may be one last one. Nope, that was not, it was a private response. Sorry about that. I think we're done with questions, so maybe we can share the resources and wrap it up. I think this was super helpful for me.
All right, thank you very much for bearing with us till the end, folks, and braving through the initial issues. We appreciate everyone's time, and please keep questions coming in our public facing forums such as Microsoft QA and GitHub. And here you see some resources for you to both learn as well as start to adopt containers on Azure. Thank you very much, folks.